Hello and welcome to this episode of Questioning Behaviour. My name is Sarah Bowen and I'm here with my good friend Melle van den Akker.
Hey, good morning, good evening or good afternoon, wherever you may be.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't believe in science.
And on this episode, we are going to be talking to a tried and tested interdisciplinarian, which I'm very excited to talk about how it's possible to do real interdisciplinary work, crossing over between behavioural science and philosophy and many other fields as well. And also going to be talking to someone with an amazing background knowledge in sort of philosophy of science and, how that shapes, how you do behavioural science research. So today we're going to be talking to Erik Angner.
Which is the British pronunciation of his last name. We'll just leave it at that.
Yes, I apologise, Erik. I'm so sorry. I should have let Melle do the name pronunciations. But my first question to you, my friend, is have you had any experience being an interdisciplinarian?
Well, my undergraduate degree is liberal arts, which I don't know. I don't, despite it being literally the best educational program ever, I don't mention it very often. But yeah, so I used to be in University College Maastricht, which is one of the Dutch UCs, which is by default interdisciplinary. And I have actually done courses in philosophy. I've done two. So I've done philosophy of science, which is applicable to our chat today. And I've also done political philosophy, which ironically turned out to be much more useful than I had ever expected. I still think philosophy of science was more useful, granted what I do. But I can mix in a political debate. Don't you worry, I got this.
Ooh, interesting. I knew you had this skill set, but I didn't know where it came from. So
my undergrad,
now I know.
I was taught this between the ripe ages of 18 and 19, and I was just sitting in that class being like, politics, I doubt it's gonna work for me, but it did in the end stick in my brain somewhere, somehow.
Yeah.
How about you?
No, it's interesting. I mean, you probably classify me as like very much a specialist in economics.
Yeah.
Straight economics undergrad, behavioural economics masters to the PhD. But I did get to take some courses in philosophy and politics in my undergrad. And it's very strange, but that one course I took in philosophy, which was critical thinking, I still use today. Like from what I learned when I was 19, I didn't think the course was, interesting enough by itself to like make me keep coming back to philosophy.
Okay.
But with hindsight, the things I learned in those classes I use today all the time. So it's strange how, it has definitely had an impact on me. And I do love talking about philosophy, even though I'm quite naive and there's a lot that I don't know. I do really enjoy engaging in a good philosophical debate. Lots of questions, not many objective answers. It's kind of cool.
But that's not the point, though.
Well, I don't know. Sometimes posing the right questions can trigger the right discussion.
I meant the objective answer part. I mean, I know in philosophy there's quite a lot of streams of thought, although I'm not sure that's the right way of saying it. But obviously, depending on the stream of thought that you're rolling with, whatever they take as their base assumptions, whatever they assume concepts to mean, I think you can get to quite different answers. But I'm wondering then if I'm describing philosophy or just psychology, because psychology has the same issue. Anyway, I think we're starting our own debate here, which is not at all the point, given especially that we are not the experts. I think we should just dive into it, get Erik on the call, and just see how, through his background in philosophy, he has been able to inform all of his other work, which is in behavioral science, in economics, but applying that and applying insights from philosophy to just a wide array of fields. I know we're going to discuss a medical collaboration as well. So honestly, dear listener, if you're interested in like applying just your own background, whichever background it may be, to a different field of study and just figure out how that works, this is a conversation for you. So let's just dive into it. And in that case, welcome to the show today, Erik. Please tell the crowd, who are you, what do you do, and how did you get there?
My name is Erik Angner. I'm a professor of practical philosophy at Stockholm University, where I grew up. I am a philosopher of science and an economist by training. So I started off in philosophy, drifted into philosophy of science, decided I had to do a little bit of economics in order to know what I was talking about. And then there was a mission creep and, it was all downhill from there, I guess. And so I ended up getting a PhD in economics first, and then a PhD in history and philosophy of science. And then, I was off to the races, I guess.
Yeah, off to the races. I think you had already started the races, had gone around the racetrack a couple of times when you decided to do 2 PhDs. For me, that is the main question for this entire episode. Just why? But also how?
Yes.
Well, it was funny. My first economics teacher was Al Roth, who won the Nobel a few years later.
Yeah, not
and
bad.
I remember meeting with him. It might have been the first meeting even, where he sort of sized me up and he said, well, you want to be careful around here because economics is a slippery slope. Like you take one course of this and then you might find yourself, here. And he was waving around like at all the piles of paper in his office and whatever. And I sort of laughed at that. But in a way, he was right. I found economics totally compelling, and one thing led to another, and then I had enough credits almost for a master's degree, and so I decided to keep going. And then, having passed my comps and stuff for fun, really not because I had to, but just as a challenge, I decided to go on and write a thesis. But I was really lucky. I mean, so much of success and failure is circumstantial, right? I happened to be in Pittsburgh at the time because of the philosophy of science program, which is top notch for philosophy of science. I knew nothing about economics there, but at the economics department, there was Al Roth and his whole group. So some really good game theorists and experimental economists doing what was at the time sort of really edgy stuff. And then across the way at Carnegie Mellon, Herbert Simon was still teaching there, and a large group of behavioral economists were active. So George Lowenstein and Baruch Fischoff and Robin Dawes, who is not as known as he should be, but who was really a total genius and a pioneer in this field. And they were also really welcoming. Like economists are not known to be like the most humble and modest and welcoming people on the average. But I was really fortunate in that everybody welcomed me and seemed to be happy to have me around. Part of that, I think, was just like availability bias, because I was told in the economics department that their best student ever was a philosophy dropout. And so I guess they had very positive associations for when it came to philosophers. And
I see. Now I know how to, enter the Pittsburgh area. I still just also, in addition to the PhD, I now also need a philosophy degree. Excellent. I'll put it on the to-do list.
Try it out. But it turns out, so philosophy and economics strike many people as a weird combination, right? It's looked at askance, at least to some extent, but it's a really good combination, in part because philosophy has philosophy of science, right? Which addresses all these questions about what a science is and what you can measure and like how you model things, and virtues like realism. How do you trade that off the ability to predict things? Well, these are core questions in the philosophical literature and the philosophy of science literature. And they're questions that behavioral economists and others struggle with on a regular basis, just because it's like the scientific questions. And then there's all the literature on welfare and well-being. And so I started getting interested in happiness research early on, which is, about human well-being and about what sort of thing we should pursue in our lives and what sort of thing we should promote by means of policy or whatever. And there's literally like 2,500 years of writing on that in philosophy, but the economists don't really read that. They don't cite it. In many cases, I think they're broadly ignorant of its existence. And so what I did, I think, to the extent that I've done anything successfully, is a sort of intellectual arbitrage where I picked up on insights that the philosophers considered maybe totally trivial, but that weren't sufficiently appreciated in the economic literature. And I kept doing that, and it's still working out quite well. I think
excellent.
to some extent originality is overrated, right? So many of us try to do something for the first time, and we're often frustrated when we realize that somebody did that, or somebody else had the same thought, or published it 20 years ago, or whatever. But the challenge is not to say things until they've been said, but rather to say things until they've been properly appreciated. And so many things that have been said are not yet appreciated, right? They're not integrated into our thinking. We haven't quite spelled out the implications of them. And connecting interesting thoughts in different literatures is, one, real work, two, kind of difficult, but three, extremely valuable. It prevents us from having to reinvent the wheel over and over again the way, many of us do.
Could you give us an example of something that, philosophers would just take for granted as being so obvious that wasn't obvious to economists or within the economics literature at the time?
The well-being literature, I think, offers plenty of examples of that. And so when you look at different ways that behavioral scientists go about measuring well-being, we have the traditional economic measures that are income-based or consumer surplus or whatever. You have the stuff that the UN has been doing, the Human Development Index and whatever. And then you have the psychologists working on subjective well-being and happiness research and whatnot. I think like every philosopher basically looking at that literature for the first time understands that those traditions are based on different conceptions of what well-being is. So in the philosophical literature, and like every philosophy freshman can tell you this, there are, different traditions. Some people think of well-being in terms of happiness. They tend to be called hedonists. Other people think of well-being in terms of preference satisfaction, right? They're preferentialists. And then there are people who think of well-being as, a number of things that are just good for a person independently of whether you want those things or not. Those are called like objectivist theorists, and the different approaches to welfare measurement reflect, at least in part, different assumptions about what well-being is. So this is a contested notion. It's not like every philosopher has the answer to the nature of well-being, but what happens in the empirical literature is that there's a massive amount of confusion because people seem to think that they're operating with the same conception of well-being when in effect they're not. So you get these psychologists who say, Aristotle talked about eudaimonia or happiness, and, these economists have talked about economic welfare, but we've got to measure well-being the way it really is. We have to measure it directly, and so we have to ask questions about happiness. That just fails to recognize that what the economists are trying to measure is something radically different. They're trying to measure preference satisfaction, whereas the psychologists are trying to measure some mental state, an effective mental state or some such. And so there are sort of underlying conceptual questions that the philosophers they haven't answered them in the sense that, they can't tell you what the right answer is. There's still disagreement. But philosophers have thought things through, right? They've been at it for 2,500 years in the Western tradition alone. They've thought through the arguments and the counter arguments, 15 steps down. Whereas you can tell that even economics laureates who start working on happiness have not, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's just one of those examples.
Interesting.
It's one hell of an example. I'm just wondering because, I am arguably a psychologist by training, Sarah's an economist, and we do realize that we have a very different approach to how we do things, the way that we've been taught certain concepts, certain methodologies. But is the best way forward then to actually establish through the use of philosophy, given that they have actually given this some decent thought for a couple of millennia, would it be to some extent a solution to at least get on the same page? Because we're clearly not even on the same page. I don't think we're in the same library.
Yeah. So what I'm not saying is that we should just defer to the philosophers because they have their own blind spots and they're, as ignorant as many social scientists are of the philosophical tradition. The ignorance is mirrored by the philosophers' ignorance of the empirical literature, right? And like I said, philosophers don't exactly have the answer. What I would like to see is more meaningful collaboration. And we're beginning to see these. They've existed, obviously, for a long time, but I want to say, just like observing people in my network and whatever, that are becoming more and more common, that teams of psychologists include a philosopher or the other way around in the conversations about like, what are we measuring, what are we getting at, where do we want to go with this, what sort of theory do we want to build, and whatever. Because that's a sort of environment where not everyone has to learn everything, but you can nonetheless take advantage of the cumulative knowledge of these different traditions, and I think that's really a good way forward. I've done a little bit of research like this with colleagues in the medical school at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, when I was there. And it was really satisfying, I think, to everyone. So there was a group that invited me to participate. They said, like, what are you interested in? I said, well, here are some measures I would like to use. And they said, okay, cool, we'll include them in our survey. And then they have professionals who administer surveys. And, after some time, I got an Excel sheet with like all the different data that I'd asked for. And then we got together and we talked about like, what do we want to do with this? What are the papers we want to write? And we wrote them together. And so I took the lead on the ones that were like a little more philosophical. Other people took the lead on other papers, but we all got together and talked about it. And to me, it was an enormously beneficial learning experience, because I understood a lot more about what the preconditions for empirical research are and the challenges that people are facing. And they got to benefit from my knowledge and experience with philosophy, and turned out to be pretty productive. I think from their perspective, I was unbelievably cheap, right? Philosophers' salaries are just so low. And, going to medical school means that, I was a rounding error to them. And so I want to think that from their perspective, this was a good deal, but I learned a lot, and I learned a lot that was useful even for my purely like philosophical work. So when philosophers look at empirical research and various efforts to measure things, happiness or well-being or whatever, very often the first reaction is like, well, this doesn't really capture it, right? There are conditions under which this measure is not going to correspond to the real thing. And then they might write these papers saying, what the psychologists fail to notice is that, there are conditions under which these measures break down or whatever. But the thing is, like, when you work with practicing scientists, you realize that they're actually pretty thoughtful. Like, people have thought these things through. They know that the measures are fallible, right? They know that they're not perfect, but they have a job to do, right? They can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so they're often like well aware of these sorts of problems. And then you have a situation maybe where the philosophers show up and they're like, well, you don't understand. And the psychologists or the behavioral scientists, they understand full well, but the task they're trying to engage in or the thing they're trying to do is quite different from what the philosophers are trying to do. And so the experience, the interdisciplinary research experience, has given me a certain degree of humility and indeed respect for what these scientists are trying to do. It's not that easy, right, to be a behavioral scientist, and we should recognize that.
Well, we appreciate that. So thanks for admitting that our job is not as easy as we sometimes make it look. So I have in my life taken 2 courses in philosophy, and I'll admit they were mandatory, though I did thoroughly enjoy them. I will mention that.
Oh, good. Both of you have excellent philosophy departments, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't do it at work. But it's good to know Nottingham and Warwick have good philosophy departments, so they can put that in their cap. But I'm wondering about just a general idea. Do you feel that currently in the training that most scientists, not just behavioral scientists, but scientists in general, do you feel that we are moving away too much from the general principles of which science was built, which was essentially philosophy, because all sciences do come from philosophy? Because I don't think most of my friends who do study the beta fields, so what we call physics, chemistry, the difficult stuff, I don't think they have much training in philosophy of science. At least I'm not aware of it. Is that going to become increasingly problematic if we don't really understand the assumptions of what we are studying or how we are studying it?
Well, so I understand opportunity costs, right? And
Sure.
I appreciate that not everyone can know everything, and so I hesitate to say everyone categorically should spend more time studying philosophy or philosophy of science. Something else would have to go, and that could be something that could turn out to be really important. So I'm not sure what I what I want to say about this. I will say that we live in a world with increasing specialization, right? So we have these sciences that split off from philosophy some time back. The sciences are divided in subdisciplines and sub-subdisciplines. And, I talk to my friends who go to the big neuroscience meeting every year, and it's like tens of thousands of people working in very many different disciplines. There's no one person who has an overview of what's going on at these meetings, right? It's like so many sub-disciplines not talking to each other and whatever. And this is just a fact. There's division of labor. That's a good thing, right? The opportunity cost. Not everyone can know everything, right? But at the same time, like what happens is that there must be development in the various disciplines that could benefit other disciplines, but that don't because nobody knows about them. So if we stick with the metaphor of the division of labor, which maybe is more than a metaphor, we learned, right, back from Adam Smith, that you don't get to reap the rewards of division of labor unless you have trade. And in trade or intellectual trade in this context would mean that I share the fruits of my labor with you, right? And you share the fruits of your labor with me. And I guess
what would you like to know about payment methods? Just ask.
Oh, I would know everything about it. Right? But so this is the sort of situation where we're in. We have division of labor, but we don't have intellectual trade, at least not to the extent that we should. And I think we can look at some people who have, deliberately and blatantly flouted these boundaries. And Herbert Simon is probably the best example, right? He was a polymath. Clearly, not all of us are geniuses and such, but he was able to, over the course of his life, to migrate from one discipline to another. And he ended up, obviously he made contributions to all of those disciplines, but he also managed to combine them into a piece of work that's radically novel and interdisciplinary. And again, not everyone can do this, not everyone should do this, but it seems like there's a good thing that there are some people who do, right? And it's a good thing to include them in our professional communities and in our courses and coursework and whatever. And so I guess that's where I'm going with this. I don't want to eliminate the disciplines, right? I think disciplines are good and division of labor is good, but we have to figure out ways individually and as a community of scholars to benefit from what people find out in other subdisciplines. Part of that is going to be encouraging people across these boundaries. Another part is going to be forming communities where people can share their insights and so on, and in the sort of way that I just gestured at earlier.
And I mean, it's something I think I've heard the term interdisciplinary thrown around a lot, sort of in recent times, with the impact agenda, sort of when you apply for funding, it's can you show that you are part of an interdisciplinary team and things like this. But I mean, is it sufficient enough, do you think, to get people to work this way or not?
No, I mean, that doesn't sound sufficient at all. I don't want to say anything in defense of the REF exercise. It sounds like a nightmare for all I can tell. One insight I think is that genuinely interdisciplinary work is kind of hard. So I had this experience when I walked across the way to the economics department the first time of being in a radically different culture. People dress differently from what they did in philosophy or in the humanities. They use a different language. The sense of humor was different. The terminology was different.
Do economists have a sense of humor?
Hey.
Let me
just asking.
You might not find it funny, but there's something that passes for humor for sure. But so yes, in certain ways, walking across the way to another faculty gave me vibes similar to those of landing in a new country the first time and trying to figure out what people are doing. And the interesting thing about this is that or the metaphor is useful, I guess, because you can't just go to a different culture and like ask them, well, how are you different? Right? You can land in Italy and just expect people to explain to you. This is something you have to figure out in part by immersing yourself in the culture and living in it, and then like gradually finding the clues and whatever. And you will, right? If you live there. So I think the conclusion is that if you really want to understand what another disciplinary culture is on about, it's not something you can't just like helicopter into it and then expect to make a contribution, right? You also can't expect to learn a ton from them right away, because you need to know like where they're coming from and what the assumptions are and whatever. And it took me certainly like a year or two before I felt somewhat at home in this new culture, the culture of the econs. I guess now in most environments where I move, I'm accepted as a full-fledged member of both communities, but I still get those weird little looks sometimes, as in, you are not a real economist. But then behavioral economists do. Yeah.
Is it because of how you dress?
Yeah, it's certainly not my sense of humor.
Excellent. Good to have that established.
Right. But no, so, making productive interdisciplinary work happen is not something you can do just like putting people in the same room. It requires a dedicated effort on both sides, and that's going to require some degree of respect for what you're doing, right? You have to approach this other culture not necessarily with a feeling that, or the thought that everything they do is right, but you certainly shouldn't have the attitude that everything they're doing is like wrong or wicked, the way some people think about economics in particular, right? There's this whole like tradition of anti-economics that like rejects everything that economics stands for. And if you have somebody from that movement or that side trying to collaborate with an economist, well, that's not probably going to go very well.
It's going to be a shouting match, to say the least.
Yeah, talking over each other. Okay. So, I mean, can we solve this problem like behavioral scientists? I mean, it sounds like it's, are people sufficiently motivated to actually engage with other disciplines? Are there like incentive structures in place? Because if I'm thinking from like with my academic hat on, even though it's very small, a lot of what drives research, you think about how easy is this going to be to get published and what journal am I going to put it in? Sometimes with the interdisciplinary work, it's not enough of like an economics piece and not enough of a philosophy piece or psychology piece. I mean, but as you said, with your interdisciplinary collaborations, it was multiple papers that came out of one project. Is that more of how we should be thinking about this? It's actually you could still have the best of both worlds without having a compromise in that sense.
I mean, I think you can, right? You can do interdisciplinary work that reflects back onto the disciplines in a way that everyone should recognize as a genuine contribution to your discipline. But the incentives certainly matter. I mean, then, I mentioned it, having been like really lucky early on. And one of the ways in which I was really fortunate was that I was in a history and philosophy of science department, which is inherently interdisciplinary. So people study the history of science and the philosophy of science. Everyone is required to go take so many credits in some science of their choosing. Many of the faculty would publish in scientific journals as well as in philosophy journals. And so there was no pressure on me at all to do anything that looked like, Kant or Wittgenstein or something. And then I ended up in a small but really nice philosophy department in Birmingham, Alabama, where my seniors told me very explicitly that they could not care less in which journal I published in. I had to be productive, right? I had to do stuff in order to earn tenure, but they made it very clear that I could do whatever I wanted. And that helped me because I didn't
Where is the supervision? There's not a single PhD student or a single early career researcher that has had that feedback. Honestly.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite rare. And of course, if you have advisors or, committees who insist on you doing something that looks really traditional, then the sort of work might strike them as weird. And so this is something we should work it's not a task that a graduate student can accomplish, right? But as a community and as a profession, we should think about how we make our environment hospitable to people who want to do work that's genuinely interdisciplinary. So that's certainly going to be important. But then like one thing we can do as individuals is to be better at explaining what we're doing. And this is something I've been pushed to do, and that I think in a way was sort of educational for me. Like if you work on Kant in a philosophy department, you're never, ever going to have to justify yourself to your peers, right? No colleague is going to say like, is that really philosophy, or why should I care about this? Whereas if you do philosophy of science, and if you do it in a sort of naturalistic way, in a way that's informed by the actual facts, you can get these sorts of reactions. And, I get them still, not so often as I used to, but every so often somebody goes like, well, why is this philosophy and why should I care? Or they say, well, I certainly don't care about this or whatever. That is not conducive to interdisciplinary work, but it's also an encouragement to you, the individual, to get better at explaining what you're trying to do and why it matters to your discipline. And so if everyone in your discipline is making a certain assumption that you explore or that you want to argue against or that you want to replace by something, then it matters to the discipline, right? What you come up with, even if they're not that interested in the evidence base that you're using, if it bears on assumptions that everyone in your discipline is making, then it becomes relevant, right? So think about the happiness stuff. Suppose you're in a department where everybody does like happiness research or whatever, but you're looking at this philosophical literature, which is vast, that says that well-being and happiness have no like essential connection. They're not at all as tightly connected to each other as people might think.
I was wondering about this earlier. I was wondering because, Sarah is well versed in this literature. I personally am not. So, when you were talking about well-being and happiness, and obviously you can't really replace the one with the other because that just definition-wise doesn't even make sense. I was like, I see where you're coming from, but I'm not entirely sure what the real distinction is.
Well, so here's a factoid that I think is relevant. So in psychology, I think like very often people believe that well-being is more or less synonymous with happiness. It's not universally true for sure, right? There are lots of people who reject that, and maybe more and more people. But early on in the happiness research, I shouldn't say early on because it goes back like 100 years, right? But in the 90s and aughts, like lots of people were saying that well-being is happiness and that's what we ought to maximize or whatever. It was and has been a very popular view among certain kinds of behavioral scientists. Now, if you look at the philosophical literature, like that view was big back in the, 17, 1800s. These days, it's not at all a common view. Like the view that we can understand well-being in terms of like sensory pleasure or something. There are people defending that view, but they're vanishingly few. It's absolutely a minority view. And so this is kind of interesting, right? You have a community that spent like 2,500 years thinking about this, and they've broadly rejected a view that the behavioral scientists have accepted for decades now to a very great degree, right? There's some sort of disconnect there. And, if the one literature isn't relevant to the other literature, then I don't know what relevance means, because surely that's relevant, right? And right,
I'd argue so.
you see what I'm getting at, right? This is not the way to make friends with your colleagues or supervisors in the psych department, maybe, but they're making philosophical assumptions. There's a literature that's exploring these assumptions. There are arguments back and forth, and bracketing those concerns is sort of anti-scientific because it involves taking on board very strong assumptions about the nature of the subject matter without any reflection and even knowing or suspecting that all of that might be false.
I think after this conversation, I need to call a friend of mine who studies well-being to let him know that he might want to check his assumptions. Poor man.
It's a good idea. It's
definitely. And any other assumptions we're currently making as behavioral scientists about world problems that you think we should revisit?
Well, so another thing has to do with policy, I guess, and what we ought to maximize. It's a related question in a way, but lots of behavioral scientists are interested in policy, right? We want to change the world and not just understand it. But then, in order to come up with policy recommendations, it's not enough to have like facts and theories about, what is and what isn't. You also have to have some sort of policy goal, right? You have to have some sort of idea about what you want to promote, what's good, and very often that thing is welfare. Like sometimes people talk about the importance of respecting stuff like autonomy and freedom and whatever, but these are also like hard. These are part of like the hardcore of the philosophical tradition, right? What are the things we should maximize in policy? What are the sort of things we need to respect? If you look at the nudging literature, for example, you have both of these elements. So there's this idea of like paternalism, of benefiting somebody, improving their welfare, well-being, where the idea is that at least under certain circumstances, we should maximize welfare. But then we should do it in a way that respects individual autonomy and freedom, which means that we should also value this. We should put weight on this value of personal autonomy. And what are those things? And, under what circumstances do they matter? You have all these arguments in literature about whether nudging really truly respects a person's authentic desires or autonomy or freedom or whatever. And these are also philosophical issues. These are, issues that philosophers have been going on about for hundreds of years. And, just looking at this, it should be pretty obvious that literature is relevant to this literature, right? You can't just assume that we should maximize this or respect that. Those are substantive, philosophical, normative assumptions. At a minimum, you should recognize that that's what they are, right? That you don't have a defense for them. Ideally, though, you should make some effort explaining why this is the thing we should maximize rather than this other thing, and so on.
Yeah, no.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
It makes complete sense. I'm now just really, really worried.
You worried? What are you worried about, Mjella?
Just the fact that every assumption I've ever made in my research is just grounded in absolutely nothing. So you're not the first philosopher I've ever talked to. So yay me.
Oh, good.
I've edged into the interdisciplinary field. It's just, I always feel like, and it is in absolutely no way meant as disrespect, so please don't take it that way, but every single time I talk to someone who is doing a vastly different research from me, or in a different way with a different background and different assumptions and preconceived notions, if you will, that at the end of it, what ends up happening if we have a discussion is that we end up with way more questions and even less solutions than we had at the start. So because you are so well versed in interdisciplinary research, as you've already mentioned, you've even ventured into medical research. My question then becomes, how do you even make this work? Because especially with medical research, if you're trying to save lives or trying to get somewhere, there is going to be some type of a time pressure, and you do need practical output. Whereas every interaction I've had with interdisciplinarity, although thoroughly enjoyed and thoroughly educational, I don't think I've ever managed to achieve the stage of practical output. So how do I reach that stage?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. And maybe especially as a grad student, you have a certain degree of time pressure. You have all these books you need to read, but bizarrely, the more you read, the more you feel like you ought to read more, right? Mm-hmm. You push the boundary outwards. You never get to a point where you feel like you're in command of this. And then here I am saying you should read like the history of your science and philosophy and interdisciplinary work and whatever. And it might just sound terrible. And
well,
maybe
not terrible,
but part of what I'm getting at is that, we could benefit from making our assumptions more clear. And so when we do behavioral science, we have no choice but to make philosophical assumptions. The choice that we're facing is, do we want to make those assumptions in a mindful way with some degree of awareness of what we're doing? And do we want to defend those assumptions based on, some serious reflection about the matter? Or do we just want to wing it? And if you put it in those terms, I think it's pretty obvious that just like winging it and making something up on the spot is not going to strike you as very scientific and is not going to strike you as very meaningful. But you can make your assumptions explicit. And so if you want to do happiness research, or if you're interested in well-being, I mean, go ahead and do that. But just flag in your writing that here in this at this moment, I'm making this assumption, right? I'm going to assume here that well-being is happiness. That doesn't need to be true, but that's the assumption I'm going to make for these purposes. And then in the limitation sections, by the end, you can say, well, I made that assumption. It doesn't have to be true. You could even include a brief conversation, a brief discussion of what would happen if you had made other assumptions. Do you think you would have gotten the same answer so that it doesn't matter? Or do you think your answer would have been like radically different? That you can mention that also. And this is okay as a scientist, whether you're a budding scientist or whether you're a very senior one, right? You have to make assumptions, but you can flag what they are and you can be mindful of them. And I think the norms that we operate under, and this is true both in science and philosophy, I mean, to the extent that I know, is that as long as you're honest about your limitations, you're good, right? What you shouldn't do is shove stuff under the carpet and pretend like there's nothing, right? That sort of thing can get you in trouble during a dissertation defense or something. But as long as you're honest...
Is that not how you get published?
Well, I wouldn't recommend trying it, although some people clearly have. But the point is that you can flag these things, you can list them as limitations, you can say, well, here's something I want to come back to one day, and then maybe you will, right? And you can build a research project where you start off using one measure or one conception of something, and then later on you can switch to another conception and do the same thing or whatever, and then you're good to go. Like, you don't have to read everything, you don't have to know everything, right? You don't have to talk to every scientist. Your advisors would be very upset if they heard me say, any of that. But just like as a first step, being mindful of the places where we make assumptions, being mindful of the stuff, the baggage we take on board is a very good place to start. And that's okay, because this is how science works. You always have to make assumptions. Some of them are like statistical in nature. You might assume like a normal distribution or normally distributed error terms. You might not be able to prove that, but you can offer some reasons to think maybe that that's a reasonable assumption. And at a minimum, if you mention it and bring it up among the limitations, you're good, right? Nobody would think less of you as a scientist. And I'm thinking we should think about the philosophical assumptions in much the same way. It's fine to make philosophical assumptions about the nature of the subject matter and the nature of the thing you want to maximize, and how you go about doing science and how you value different scientific virtues against each other. But as long as you're honest about it and you bring it up in a serious kind of way, you're good. If you then want to add a little bit of philosophical reflection, even better, right? You're going to come across as a thoughtful, serious scholar, and you will be, right? Because this is how we do good scholarship.
I think that's, yeah.
So don't be overwhelmed. I mean, I'm here talking about interdisciplinarity, right? I think it's really important. I think this intellectual trade that I was discussing is really valuable. I think we should have more conversations across disciplinary boundaries focused on problems rather than like disciplinary disputes. But none of that is to say that you shouldn't be getting your work done or that you can without like knowing everything first, because that would clearly be suboptimal.
No, I think it's a good exercise, as you said, to try and make the implicit explicit.
Yeah. I mean, the nature of measurement is another question that appears in the philosophical literature. So it's what scientific measurement is, like under what conditions you have it, whether you know that you have it. These are things that philosophers of science have worked on for, 100 years as a core question. And there's some really interesting research going on there. In the meantime, you have these debates among scientists, to some extent between economists and psychologists about like the preconditions for measuring things like happiness and preference satisfaction. And you have like historically lots of economists saying like you can't measure unobservable things like happiness and optimism and introversion and whatever. And then the psychologists say, well, you sure can. Look at me, I'm doing it as we speak. And that's another question where philosophical literature might not be able to tell you unambiguously what measurement is, but it has all these conceptions that are very explicit, and it has arguments for and against, and it represents a whole profession who has thought things through. And so clearly there are going to be points in your career, there are going to be points in a research stream when that literature could, on the margin, be useful for you. Or this question about how you evaluate theories. So if you look at the debate between the neoclassical economics and behavioral economics, looking at this from a very bird's eyes point of view, right? Or, some stylized facts, you could say that behavioral economists are willing to tolerate more complex theories in the interest of what they like to call realism, right? Well, consistency with the data or whatever. Whereas the neoclassical economists tend to favor, one unified theory, simplicity, tractability, that sort of thing, at some cost, in terms of like realism and whatever. And if you look at it from this point of view, you might see or think immediately that this reflects like different standards that you can apply when you're assessing like the value of scientific theories. And lo and behold, like there's a literature on that, right? Also going back like 100 years or more. And philosophers will talk about these like cognitive virtues, these or epistemic virtues, these like virtues that some theories can have that make them good theories. And from this perspective, you can look at the neoclassical economists as putting relatively high weight on simplicity and tractability and unification, which are all epistemic virtues, whereas the behavioral economists put a little more weight on realism or consistency with the data and whatever. And so if you look at it from this way, you haven't like solved the question, you haven't answered the question like which is better, but you get a whole new perspective on like what the argument is about, like what are we talking about, and also possibly like some idea of how to find a way forward. At a minimum, like this sort of realization could encourage you to make explicit what your assumptions are. And so suppose you appear like in a policy context, you're an economist and you want to tell the government like how to deal with a pandemic or whatever. If you're a neoclassical economist, you could say, well, here's my answer, and it's based on the following values, right? Simplicity accounts for so much more than like realism or whatever. And then some other economist who comes up with a different answer should be able to say, well, here's my answer, and my answer is informed by these other values. This basic idea isn't new, right? So Gunnar Myrdal, the 76 Nobel laureate, wrote about this way back when. So to his mind, we would never be able to do economics in a way that's completely free from this sort of values. So the best we can do is to make those values explicit and own up to the fact that we're making these assumptions. And so here are, I guess now, sort of three examples of situations where sort of purely scientific, or what might strike you as like purely scientific debates, reflect and are informed by a range of different views that are sort of purely philosophical in nature. And, if you're a scientist and you don't want to do everything from scratch, which would be suboptimal, right? You can go to this literature and engage in a little bit of the sort of arbitrage that I talked about, and you can make progress. So here's a story I'd like to come back to. I was at a conference at some point, and I met somebody who had read a text I wrote on behavioral economics with George Lowenstein, and it tried to sort of account for what behavioral economics was and how it was different from neoclassical economics. And this economist I was talking to was like, well, thank you so much for writing that paper. So I'm a behavioral economist. My husband is a neoclassical economist. And finally, I understand what we have been arguing about all these years. And so,
and their marriage still works. I mean, I think
marriage worked, but I got the sense that both of them were happy to understand like what they had been arguing about. And so again, like this sort of philosophical perspective didn't in and of itself like immediately solve all the problems, but at a minimum, it appears to have brought some problems into focus, which, on the margin has got to be a good thing, right?
I'd argue so.
Oh, well
At
done,
least
Erik.
one marriage saved.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know what happened to the marriage, so I should not say anything about that. But yeah, I mean, potentially.
Okay. Then I'm quite curious, what is the publication that you are most proud of?
Oh, the The one I like the best, I think, really, is the one on economist overconfidence. It's not in this stream of research, but it integrates some philosophical reflections with some scientific works. I was interested in the role that economists play in policy context, like why, what they're trying to accomplish, and why things sometimes go wrong. So I had a couple of cases in mind where I thought economists had really embarrassed themselves by giving terrible advice and being, excessively confident in their abilities. And I came across this cog sci literature on overconfidence, which, goes back 50 years now or something, that's been replicated time and time again. And so it's pretty solid as far as behavioral science goes. And what it shows, of course, is that we're by and large sort of extremely overconfident, right? There are exceptions and whatever, but by and large, we're all susceptible to this. So it's not like some people who are overconfident and the rest of us are not, but it's like all of us are prone to this. And this sort of research was really useful, it seemed to me, to sort of identify what had gone wrong with these economists up here and gave their advice, and also to come up with some policy suggestions, like some ideas that I thought we might want to implement to counteract this tendency to be excessively confident. Because I really think it's harmful when you have economists who appear and claim to know stuff they don't.
Oh, yeah.
You can think of your own examples, right? Of economists who helicopter in and they're like, oh, you don't see, you don't understand incentives, or you don't understand trade-offs, and what you have to do is such and such. Some of this happens in the media, some of it happened in places like the World Bank, where people with a PhD in economics, never having seen a data set, end up effectively in charge of some poor country someplace. And that sort of thing just can't be good. And so that was sort of an effort in sociology of science, I guess, more than anything, but I relied on some tools that I had picked up in philosophy and this research stream in behavioral decision research, and I thought the result was quite satisfying.
Nicely put. I'm not going to go back to make sure I read that paper, because I think I do remember reading it, but I mean, as you've mentioned, by this stage we've read so many things. Nothing stands out anymore.
Yeah, no point in going back to this, but I guess it was an example of like the sort of interdisciplinary work you can do.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether or not gender came into it as well.
With overconfidence? Yeah. So there's some research on that, unsurprisingly. There's a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that it's called Boys Will Be Boys or something. Yeah. And it looks at men and women making decisions in the real world, like with their retirement savings or whatever it is. And consistent with the hypothesis that men are more overconfident, men trade a lot more. So they think they can predict what the stock market is going to do to a greater extent than women can. And also,
is that
as you would...
paper by Odin?
Could be. Suddenly I'm blanking on the author's name. But yeah, so what happens is that men trade more, right? And as everybody knows, like trading a lot is hazardous to your wealth. And so they end up like losing money in the process. And the cumulative losses are enormous, right? Once you add up all the losses for all these men, it's a very large number relative to like how the women did. And so the gender effects you would expect seem to be present in the data, and they're also really harmful. Exactly as you'd expect. You're smiling. I'm not going to ask you who you're thinking about, but yeah.
Maybe another reason why we need some more diversity in the field of economics as well.
I think that's right. Yeah. So if you think overconfidence is a bad thing, you want to ask yourself, like, how can we reduce it, like individually and as a group? And there's some things you can do. So on an individual basis, making sure you make accurate, unambiguous predictions, and then checking those predictions against data is a good way to give yourself feedback, because feedback matters. Another thing you can do is to ask yourself reasons that you might be wrong. And so we're trained in conversation and whatever to produce reasons that were right? You anticipate being challenged, and so you prepare yourself mentally with reasons that you're right. But spending so much time thinking about reasons that you might be right tends to exaggerate your confidence, because you've thought about all these reasons that support your claim, right? Whereas being forced to think about, or forcing yourself to think about reasons that you may be wrong, might help you see that there are all sorts of scenarios where your predictions might turn out to be false, and that could help you regulate your overconfidence a little bit. But then you can think about how to build an overconfidence-proof culture. Like, what do you want to do in your group? Well, one thing you want to do is that you want to make it possible for people to admit that they made mistakes, right? If you mess up or you change your mind or whatever, it's got to be possible to confess that without ridicule or, other penalties. And this is totally this is the opposite of what we tend to do, right? If you're on Twitter or something and you say, I was totally wrong a year ago about the pandemic, so many people are likely to come down on you hard, right? Laughing at you. Look at this person, he's wrong about that. How can we ever trust him about these other things? And that's the opposite of what we want to do, right? We want to have an environment that encourages people to admit that they were wrong, that encourages people to say that they don't know, right? In many contexts, the opposite is true. You want to make sure not to select for overconfidence, right? If you're a manager and you're hiring people based on how confident you are in effect selecting for overconfidence, which, might harm your group. And then in a group setting, if you want people to be able to produce reasons why you may be wrong, you need the group to be diverse, right? If everyone is the same age as you, the same gender, has the same education, right, the same teachers, right, they're going to think of the same sort of counter arguments, right? If you have a broader group of people with a wider range of experience and training and so on, you're more likely to have people who can think of reasons why you're messing up. I feel like you see this so often in like advertising context, or you see something that's just like awfully sexist, and you ask yourself, like, how is this even possible? Like, how could nobody in the entire process like not catch this before it went live?
Because they were all men.
That's right, right? The assumption is that everyone who decided was probably a man. And the other thing might be that the people who weren't might not have felt comfortable speaking up, right? So if you have an environment where you punish people for contradicting whoever is in charge, then you're not going to hear the reasons why you may be wrong. So you want both of these things. You want the diversity in your team, but you also want an environment where people feel confident that they can produce reasons why you may be wrong without fear of like getting fired or being ridiculed or, being slapped down or something. And so I think this is a good case where there's like a relatively solid research stream in cognitive science that's like immediately applicable to your work. And these are things we can practice today, right? In your own life and in your department seminars or whatever. Just like saying, I don't know that. Like, what do you think? Can be sort of liberating. And like admitting that you were wrong when you were wrong can also be sort of liberating. It might encourage others to do the same. And then you might approach a situation where all of you are better.
This is very actionable. This is very nice. There are actually, there are solutions.
It is, right?
I like that.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, that's the other king. Yeah, I have a hypothesis that the economic job market selects on overconfidence, just on the way that we're taught to present our work and
I think,
not show weakness. Yeah.
No, I think that's true. It seems there's a phenomenon that seems to be relatively well confirmed where people confuse confidence with competence. Mm-hmm. So somebody appears, you can't observe directly how competent they are. You might be using their confidence as a marker or a proxy for competence, right? But if you do that, you're going to select for overconfidence, right? You're going to be likely to end up with overconfident people. That is, people whose confidence exceeds their competence. And so I'm sure we do this in hiring context. I'm sure we do it in academia. I'm sure we do it with like contractors and stuff as well, right? Somebody shows up and looks at something. It's like, what you need is such and such. And you're like, oh, wow, this person really seems like, he or she knows what they're doing. And in reality,
I don't think anyone with a voice like that was going to be she, Erik.
Well, you never know. The point is though, like I think we do this, and I do this too, and I will catch myself sort of making these inferences, even though I've studied this stuff. And so it's something to be mindful of.
But I think one question that we tend to end on, and it's not a small question, is how do you see the future for behavioral science, or at least maybe specifically the domain that you're working in? And because we've talked about interdisciplinarity so much, maybe with a specific view to interdisciplinarity. So how do you see the interdisciplinarity in behavioral science develop?
Well, in general terms, I think behavioral science has a really bright future. I mean, at least from my point of view, it seems like behavioral science has gotten a real uptick as a result of the pandemic. So I think lots of people understand now that the pandemic was caused in certain ways by behavior, right? By travel patterns and, other sort of behaviors, meat eating and, industrial organization and whatever. And people also appreciate, I think, that the solution is at least in part behavioral. So one, getting people to distance and wash their hands and not sneeze in each other's faces, waiting for the vaccine, then like taking the vaccine when it's available and whatever. All of these are like straight up behavioral questions, and trusting the virologists to come up with like the right answers is not going to be, the way forward. And I think there's a lot of understanding for this right now. The question then is what happens. This doesn't necessarily translate into like behavioral scientists like fixing things. So one thing is that behavioral science is still relatively immature. There are lots of things that we don't know when it comes to the engineering aspect of this. And so in physics or the natural sciences, you have this division between like the pure sciences, right? Pure physics and whatever, and engineering. And it's a whole school of engineering, right? That serves to translate the theoretical knowledge into like practical designs and whatever. We don't quite do that in behavioral science. We're not organized like that. Some of us have real good training in like the theoretical aspects, like our preference is transitive or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily translate into any knowledge about like how you get people to wash their hands or, wear a mask or what have you. So there's a certain gap there, and there's a real danger of overselling or overbuying what we can do. These are like, two sides of the same coin, I guess, or two problems that can come together. And so as we're selling our services and giving our advice, and as we're emphasizing, how useful it is to have behavioral scientists on board, I also think we need to caution against over-reliance on us, because we could really shoot ourselves in the foot. If we have a couple of behavioral scientists who are out there pretending to know what they're doing, like, pointing people, shoving people around and overconfidently giving advice or whatever, that could do more harm to the cause than anything else, really. So I think we should all be really mindful of the knowledge, the limits of our expertise, and what sort of thing we can't do. And that includes these questions about values. So as behavioral scientists, we might have like special knowledge about like norms and how you encourage people to do certain things or whatever. We don't have like disciplinary expertise in the value questions, like why is this good? Why is it a good thing if people like wear masks, right? What are the values we need to respect? Like where are the boundaries set by individual autonomy or whatever? And those are the sort of things we need to be mindful of. So I guess my general outlook is positive, but I also see a number of traps that we need to avoid as behavioral scientists.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly articulate and wonderful note to end on. Positive, but also we need to be introspective and try and battle this overconfidence that we might be incentivized to peddle.
You're much too kind. Thank you. No, I might get overconfident here.
We'll have to dampen that overconfidence. But just to say, Erik, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. I think Mella and I are probably just going to go and lie down in a dark room and just ponder all of the questions that we now have about life and science and research. Well,
thank you so much. Thank you so much for the conversation. This was great. I enjoyed it a lot, and I wish best of luck to both of you with your work.
Thank you. And you can plug anything right now if you want. Where can the listener find you? Is there something that you would like them to check out immediately after listening to this episode?
may I mention, now that you invited me, my textbook, so a course in behavioral economics, which was, I guess, one of the first textbooks that came out in behavioral economics. It's now in its third edition. It just came out earlier this year. And yeah, I think it's a pretty useful self-contained treatment. It's supposed to be useful for absolute beginners. So it doesn't presuppose any knowledge of economics. It doesn't presuppose any math past high school, and so it should be available to everyone who listens, and it raises quite a number of these questions. Now that you know about my philosophical background, I think you'll see the philosophy sort of seeping in through the cracks. You might look for that. Brilliant. But yeah, so thanks.
All right. As always, all the stuff for Erik, including his Twitter, on which he is also quite active, will be linked below. So Erik, thank you so much for making the time, and it was an absolutely great conversation.
Thank you so much.
All right, so that was us talking to Erik. I feel like I've just been educated. My mind has been open. I feel like I just need to, like Sarah said earlier, we need to lay down and just make sure we completely and utterly and properly digest this information. So I feel like it's quite unfair to already ask this to Sarah now, but what did you think? What was the main takeaway for you? Have you been inspired?
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed our conversation and just getting to speak with Erik, and particularly this recommendation that we should just be stating our assumptions explicitly, state the implicit explicitly, and actually how much benefit, how much value we would get as a discipline from building this practice into our everyday work, particularly when it comes to having communication or speaking with people or collaborating with people who have been raised in a different discipline, who have been raised with different implicit assumptions, and being able to bridge gaps and articulate, different perspectives on the same problem. I thought that was a really nice little nugget of goodness.
A nugget of goodness. I think, if we're talking about nuggets of goodness here, I think, Erik has just given me the whole KFC like family pack bucket. No, it's just, I mean, yes. As we've already stated before, like we do enjoy philosophy. We do feel like we're rather naive in it. I think it's time I dive a bit deeper back into the philosophy of science, because I do think it would be inherently useful, and I do remember enjoying it when I was younger. So I think maybe in general a recommendation for everyone, if you feel like you're stuck in interdisciplinary work because the communications between two fields seem to break down, or between two fields, two people from two different fields, maybe have a book club on philosophy. Get back to the basics, strip back everything that you're getting stuck on, and figure it out from the get-go, like people did approximately 2,000-3,000 years ago in the West. I do think it's nice that Erik has made it very, very explicit that the tradition he's discussing in philosophy is entirely Western, because we obviously do not wish to reject any other of the philosophical traditions. We are aware of them. So yeah, I thought this was just great. I think when it comes to interdisciplinary work, behavioral science in and of itself used to be interdisciplinary. That's how the field came to be. It was a bunch of philosophers, statisticians, economists, a couple of other interested people who came from a wide range of different fields. Surprising amount of engineers that that just ended up and laying the very foundations for what we now call behavioral science. So I think it's important to continue to pay homage to how this started, and to keep the application and the perspective to be interdisciplinary, rather than this is now how we do behavioral science. I mean, not really. There's still God knows how many traditions in behavioral science, despite it being a super young field, and that's not bad.
Yeah. No, it's an exciting intersection to be, but as we move forward, it's becoming its own individual field rather than this crossroads with its own language and its own terminology and theories and implicit assumptions that we teach and talk about. So I think it's just about being self-aware about all of this stuff. I mean, I freely acknowledge that it was relatively late into my academic career that it was brought to my attention that I had been making assumptions about science and knowledge production that were unconscious, because they weren't taught as this is an assumption you're making. They were taught as this is what science is. And that was really eye-opening for me. And I want to continue to have those eye-opening moments, because I'm pretty sure there are still things that I'm taking for granted in my mind and my perspective that shouldn't be taken for granted.
Don't worry, we'll keep talking to Erik. It's not. We'll have these eye-opening moments again, especially because obviously the conversation with I didn't know Erik that well before, but I was very, very impressed. But also in general, the man has the voice, the smoothness of an audiobook narrator, which I think is just really nice. I hope it properly picks up on the audio as we edit and push it out. But I think as a last point, something Erik mentioned, which stuck with me as well, because it's not the first time I've heard it from someone who's been in the field much longer. And this is that Erik, just like Dilip Soma, now Dilip did actually have a background within engineering. Erik obviously doesn't. His background is very different. But they mentioned from the hard sciences the distinction between someone who is a theorist and someone who is an engineer. Whereas maybe this would be a much more useful terminology for behavioral science as well, so we don't have to keep mucking about with the term scientist and behavioral strategist and behavioral practitioner and behavioral God knows what. Because if there's one thing going out of hand in behavioral science, except for the fact that we've got way too many biases, which is literally not contributing to anything, it is the fact that we keep coming up with terms for the people that are in the field where the terms, because of their amount and specificity, that's a word, they lose meaning. A term that has no real specific meaning and can be applied a bit haphazardly has no meaning, or not a really stable meaning. So I think that would be an interesting way to look at it. You've got behavioral engineers and you've got behavioral theorists, just like physics, just like chemistry. Just for a clearer, non-judgmental division between, who is what, who does what, who contributes to the field in which way. I think that would be a good way of going about it, personally.
Yeah, or as Dilip says, don't label the people, label the projects.
That's also very fair. Yeah. No, it's interesting to hear those perspectives, absolutely. But no, we had an absolutely great time talking to Erik. He said he had a great time talking to us, so we'll hope he was honest about that. But the Swedes tend to be quite honest in general, so that's good. And as always, everything we talked about in this episode will be linked below in the description box of whatever platform you're listening this on. And we hope you thought this was an educational, entertaining, thought-provoking, or at least interesting episode to listen to. We hope you have a great week, of course, as always, and we hope again to see you next week. Bye.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love, you're the one I wanna give to.